Any of these flaming fucking arrows come near me, I'll strangle you with your own guts. You think you wanted revenge a long time. I've been after it all my life. It's all I care about. And look at me. Look at me! You come with me. You die here.
Sandor. Thank you.
Behind that gruff, scarred exterior, Sandor Clegane's story is one of bitterness and anger that goes way deeper than just having a rough face. You can tell he doesn't just resent what others see in him, he's downright disgusted by it. The Hound was never something he chose. Instead, it's a label he's been stuck with since he was young, a symbol of everything he despises. But when you look closer, it's easy to see why the anger runs so deep. Growing up, he was molded by violence and cruelty, forced to adopt a role he didn't want. Every scar on his body tells a story, not just of battles, but of a life carved by pain and forced into brutal survival. The Hound wasn't a name he embraced. Willingly, it was a mask placed on him by others. A role that left him with little choice but to embrace the worst parts of himself. And deep down, he knew that this Hound was far from who he truly was. This identity became both his armor and his prison. He wore it to survive, to protect himself, to push away those who dared to look deeper. Yet, each time he leaned into it, he lost another part of himself. He was angry at the world, sure, but more than anything, he was angry at what he'd been turned into. That anger brood became a part of him, and, before he knew it, became something he couldn't easily shake. So here's the question. How can a man hate something so deeply when it's become a part of who he is? Let's dig into 6 reasons that show why the Hound has become the target of his loathing and the root of his pain. Imagine your life as a kid completely flipped by one traumatic moment. The scars aren't just physical reminders. They're a constant, painful memory of what was stolen from him. In his case, it was his own family that left those marks, embedding a deep sense of betrayal and fear. That moment created the first fracture in who he could have been, pushing him down a path he didn't choose. Living with that kind of pain from such a young age hardens you, and it's no surprise he built a wall around himself. He learned quickly that vulnerability was a weakness, something that could and would be exploited. The Hound became his way to cope, a tough exterior that wouldn't let anyone get too close. But deep down, he never forgave what happened to him, and he resented how it set him on this path of violence and survival. It wasn't just the physical scars that shaped him. It was the loss of trust, of innocence, of having any real guidance. As he grew up, he saw himself as something damaged, something broken by someone else's cruelty. That anger at his stolen childhood morphed into a hatred for the person he had to become to survive. In a twisted way, the Hound became the coping mechanism, but also the constant reminder of what he'd lost. And that resentment only grew with time. He never got the chance to heal or reclaim what was taken from him, and so he directed his anger inward, blaming himself, his past, and the monstrous image the world saw in him. We see glimpses of him being changed. The first was with Arya Stark. Arya was different from anyone he'd known. She saw past the Hound, not with sympathy, but with defiance. Unlike most people who feared him, Arya was never intimidated by his rough exterior or his violent reputation. Her courage shook something deep inside him. It was a wake-up call, forcing him to confront the person he'd become through someone who refused to back down. Traveling together, he found himself in a strange place, constantly challenged, questioned, and judged by someone half his size. Arya didn't accept his cruelty or his justifications, and that defiance sparked a change in him. He began to feel a strange sense of accountability, as if he had to prove to her, and maybe to himself, that he was more than just the brutal facade. Her resilience and unflinching gaze mirrored back to him the anger and bitterness he carried, forcing him to re-evaluate his path. In Arya, he saw a glimpse of who he might have been without the burdens forced on him. Her presence forced him to peel back the layers of anger and violence he'd built up over the years. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning if he really wanted to continue down the path he'd been on. The Hound had become his way of coping, but Arya made him see that he had a choice, however limited, to be something different. Her influence lingered long after they parted ways, challenging his hatred of the Hound in a way no one else had. It wasn't just about her lack of fear, but about her determination to forge her own identity. Separate from anyone's expectations, Arya reminded him that the role he played wasn't set in stone, and that knowledge, though painful, gave him a sliver of hope he hadn't felt in years. At this point, he's trapped in a self-fulfilling prophecy, acting out the beastly image people expect of him. They see him as savage, ruthless, and he begins to live up to it, even when he hates every second. This cycle becomes a twisted game. He becomes more like the Hound, because everyone sees him that way. It's as if he's playing a part in a story he can't escape. That resentment is layered. He hates the people who labeled him a monster, and hates himself for living up to it. It's a vicious cycle that spirals out of control, one he doesn't see a way out of. Each act of brutality adds another layer to his hate. Each scornful look pushes him deeper into that role he despises. He loathes the way people recoil at his presence, the disgust in their eyes that he's come to expect. It's as if every glance, every sneer, reminds him of what he's become, a beast in their eyes, and, reluctantly, and with each passing day, he sinks deeper into that hatred. Torn between the man he once was and the beast they've made him into. And so, he wears this identity like a curse, despising the way it's reshaped him, the way it's corrupted the last remnants of the man he could have been. Sansa Stark, in many ways, was his opposite. Refined, gentle, and yet resilient in her own way. When he encountered her in King's Landing, something about her vulnerability stirred a part of him that he thought was dead. Sansa didn't fear him as much as others did. She saw beyond the scars and the hardened exterior. Not fully, but enough to make him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt before. It was her quiet strength that planted a seed of compassion in him, pushing back against the violent Hound persona. Unlike Arya, Sansa didn't challenge him openly. Instead, her kindness and bravery softened the edges of his rage. She showed him a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on brute force, but on endurance and dignity. Protecting her, even in small ways, felt like a rejection of the Hound image he wore daily. In her presence, he was reminded that there was more to life than violence and anger that he could protect without destroying. Sansa's vulnerability brought out something unexpected in him, need to be something other than a weapon. For once, he saw himself as a protector, not as a brutal force, but as someone who could shield rather than harm. That shift in perspective was small but powerful, making him question the Hound identity he'd resigned himself to. He saw that he didn't have to be the monster people saw. He could be something else, even if it was only for a fleeting moment. Her influence lingered long after he left King's Landing. Sansa's resilience and quiet strength showed him a new path, however far out of reach it felt. His hatred of the Hound grew stronger, as he realized there was a better side to him, one he'd rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Her presence reminded him of the humanity he'd lost, reigniting the hope that he could reclaim it, even if it meant leaving behind the person he'd been for so long. Living as a weapon meant trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He isolated himself, pushed people away, never letting anyone see beyond his hard shell. People assumed he was a heartless brute, and he played into that, keeping everyone at a distance. The Hound persona became his shield, a way to keep others out, even if it cost him any real human connection. Over time, that isolation became suffocating. He craved companionship, understanding, but the Hound didn't allow for those things. He hated that he'd locked himself into a role that made any genuine connection nearly impossible. But breaking free of that isolation wasn't an option. Letting people in meant exposing his vulnerabilities, showing the hurt and pain he'd spent years hiding. So he kept up the walls, kept playing the role, even as he hated it more with every passing day. He felt trapped, torn between the life he knew and the life he secretly wished for. That internal struggle only made him angrier. He was his own prisoner, locked away by his own choices. And every day felt like a reminder of how much he'd sacrificed in the name of survival. When you're shaped by violence, it's easy to fall into using it as your only means of control. The role he was pushed into demanded ruthlessness. He was used as a weapon, a guard dog, someone others could rely on to do the dirty work. His life became a series of brutal orders, tasks that chipped away at his sense of self. The more he embraced that role, the less he saw himself in the mirror. Each task, each bloodied sword swing, took away another piece of his humanity. He hated how his role forced him to hurt others, to live as a tool of cruelty, even when his heart wasn't in it. But to survive, he pushed down those feelings and buried any compassion that tried to surface. The world only saw the Hound in him, not the reluctant man forced to play that part. He despised how others looked at him, seeing only the savage beast they wanted him to be. His actions became a cycle of hatred. He did what he was told, grew to resent himself, and then let that anger fuel more violence. The deeper he sank into this persona, the more he felt like a puppet, manipulated by others' expectations of him. And so, he loathed not just the deeds he committed, but the identity he had been boxed into. Every time he did someone else's bidding, he felt less like himself and more like a hollow shell filled with anger and regret. In the end, his hatred is more than personal. It's existential. He despises the role forced upon him, but he's come to see it as an inescapable part of his life. There's no easy way out, no way to shed the image without losing a piece of himself. He's trapped to this cycle of anger and violence, and he knows it. Yet, there's a glimmer of self-awareness beneath the rage. He knows he could be more than this, even if he doubts he'll ever find that freedom. The Hound represents everything he resents: pain, violence, isolation, and he's grown to hate it with every fiber of his being. But this isn't just a story of anger. It's a tragic reflection of a man shaped by circumstances beyond his control. He didn't choose this life, yet he's forced to live it, battling himself every step of the way. It's a fight that defines him, but also one he may never fully win. So, in hating the Hound, he's not just hating a name. He's rejecting everything he's been forced to become. Every label, every scar, and every brutal expectation. It's a war within. A war he fights every day, even if he never truly escapes it.